Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jerich Show. I, as always, am Javvad Malik. And alongside me is the miserable, the grouchy, the bane of my existence, Mr. Erich Crone. How are you doing, sir?
I'm wonderful. Thanks for remembering who I am, even if you can't remember who you are.
Yeah, that's the effect you have on me. I just forget.
So, Javvad, we wanted to talk about a couple things today. Let's get right into it. Some interesting times. This week, I saw a story about ransomware again. And I know we've talked a little bit about ransomware in the past. In this case, it was heartbreaking to me because it was Carnival Cruise Lines. Ooh. And this is somewhere where I've actually done a couple cruises with them. I really love cruising. And they went and got hit by ransomware on top of all the COVID-19 stuff that's kind of like cut them back. They got, money's not coming in. Now they get this. And the bad part about this, the really bad part is this was one of the strains that exfiltrated data. So that's one of the big things here, right? And we see this more and more where the data exfiltration is worse than the actual encryption piece of it, right?
Exactly. The exfiltration gives the criminals so many more options. So even if you have backups, it doesn't matter. You can recover your operations, but it doesn't matter from a criminal point of view because they've still got your data. So they can still say, okay, maybe you don't want to buy the decryptor key off us, but you sure as hell want to pay us so that we don't release this data, or we don't sell it on, or we don't use this to start attacking your customers. And that's where it gets really messy because then there's also no guarantee. I know I was speaking to someone who dealt with a third, I've got to be really careful how I word this, but one of their third parties, they got hit by ransomware and it was exfiltrated and they actually paid to get them to delete a copy. And so the company that my friend works at, they were like, that's just ridiculous. A, why would you pay them? And B, what guarantees would you have that they would actually delete it? And
right, they're criminals.
Yeah. And their response was, well, it's in their best interest to delete it. Otherwise, they're going to get a bad rep and no one will pay them in the future.
There may be some truth to that. And with ransomware and the encryption piece, there is definitely some truth to that. So if people didn't get at least some of their data back, then they wouldn't ever pay. And so I kind of understand that angle. However, here's the flip side to this. Most of these end up popping up there and they say, we're not going to publicly, expose this if you pay us. But that really doesn't mean they're not going to turn around and sell it on the dark web. Mm-hmm. And if they do, what recourse do you have? It's kind of like the ransomware gangs in the beginning of the COVID pandemic that came up and said, we're not going to attack hospitals. Yay. And if they did, what are you going to do about it? I mean, seriously, it still got to the point that the Red Cross and another group put out a joint message that was like, please stop hitting medical centers and hospitals while people are dying. It did nothing. Yeah. So when it comes to the exfiltration piece, the big issue there is, I don't care what happens. I don't care if you pay them or not. You still have a data breach on your hands. And unless it was encrypted prior to being exfiltrated, you've lost data, and who knows what they're going to do with it.
Yeah. And so I was reading some of the news, and there isn't many details I could find from the article about exactly what happened, what Carnival Cruise are doing, whether they've paid. So do you have any insight into that?
No, and that's been an interesting thing. So this happened, a few days ago, and I get it. It came to light in an SEC filing, the Security and Exchange Commission. That's what really kind of put the light on this thing. But what's interesting is, as a customer, maybe my data wasn't affected, but I've received nothing. I haven't seen a public statement from the company yet, and it's possible that I've missed it. But it seems like they're being real quiet about it. And I was certainly giving them some credit in the beginning for sure, because, we got to figure out what exactly happened here. Before you make a statement, you kind of got to know at least something. And it's important, though, that even if you don't know a lot, that you say something. Obviously, it's out there. It's being exposed. People know that they dealt with this issue. But I've honestly heard crickets on this. And that to me bothers me a little bit more with the response than anything else. And again, I understand they may be trying to get information together before they go out and go, my gosh, all this stuff happened, and then have to change their story or whatever. But, if you look at the Twitter response, that was fantastic. Hey, something happened. We're working on it. They kept it going as it was going on. And I love to see more responses like that. Unfortunately, in this case, I just haven't seen anything.
No. And speaking of responses, let me take you back a few years to 2016. And when a time before face masks, a time when people could gather in venues, a long time ago. And there's a story. So if you remember Uber had a breach where a lot of their customer data was exfiltrated.
Oh, yeah.
And their response was a bit suboptimal, let's put it that way.
That's a really nice way of putting it.
And apparently they paid the hackers like $100,000, but they funneled it through a bug bounty program to make it look like it was for a bug bounty. It was all a bit underhand. But fast forward to today, and federal prosecutors are charging the CISO, Joe Sullivan, for the breach, and they're calling it obstruction of justice and concealing a felony. And, he engaged in a scheme to withhold and conceal the breach from regulators, failed to report it to law enforcement or to the public, according to a complaint filed. And this is really interesting because it's gone on for quite a while, but also it's interesting that Mr. Sullivan is the one that's coming under all the scrutiny. Now, I understand you if you're the CISO and incident response is your bag, but I don't think this is something he would have had the authority or the ability just to execute on his own. There's no way that the rest of the senior management or the CEO or the board weren't aware that this was going, and there's no way they didn't approve of it. This isn't something that a lone wolf went out and done just off his own back. So I find it quite concerning in a way that as the CISO, he's the one. I'm not saying scapegoat, but it just feels very convenient that all the blame is being put on the CISO and not on the organization as a whole, where I think that's where the blame really lies. It's a systematic failure of many procedures and across the whole organization and legal responsibility.
Yeah, it's interesting and it's unfortunate that a lot of CISOs, we do kind of joke sometimes about they're the sacrificial lamb. When it all goes to hell, they're the ones that are going to get the blame for it. They end up getting chucked out and, bring someone else in. And then the organization can go, see, we fixed the problem. And in this case, obviously, I think you're right. I think this was probably not something that he did in a vacuum. The leadership was probably very aware of it. And so, he's getting hung out to dry. Now, it is interesting, in this case, as far as I've seen, the leadership didn't even claim that he was doing this in a vacuum, like that he was the only one that knew about this. So their silence is kind of deafening on that side of things. I'll tell you, I knew the CISO at the U.S. Postal Service when the breach happened a number of years ago. It was when I was with ISC Squared. He was on one of our advisory boards. And, I'll never forget kind of how that went down. He had been there for years, and he was talking about how, basically he knew that his job was forfeit. That was just part of him being in that role. He knew that somebody would have to, get the responsibility dropped upon them. And so he knew that he was going to end up having to retire. And it's unfortunate because we do see that in these roles a lot. And it is kind of a bit of a joke, It
is. And I mean, I've not known a Joe Sullivan prior to this incident or, during this incident, but someone pointed it out on LinkedIn, on Twitter today, that on LinkedIn, he's actually himself is a former federal prosecutor. So I think he would be more than aware of the laws around it and the consequences and everything. So, I mean, having been in a lot of organizations, I wouldn't have been surprised if he was maybe even pushing back against it and the board steamrolled him and vetoed its thing, which happens in many organizations as well. So there's a lot of things that make me uncomfortable about the situation.
Yeah.
Obviously, more details will come out as time tells. But I think it's one of those things that it's a bit like accounting. So I don't know what it's like in the States, but even over here, even if you use an accountant, you actually sign it yourself and say, well, yeah, I confirm that all the information I provided to the accountant was correct, and and to the best of my knowledge and everything. So you can't just put the blame on someone else, even if they're the expert in the field. You as the business owner or the individual, you still have that accountability and responsibility, which is missing here.
Yeah, absolutely. And the overall story we should take from this, or lesson we should take from this, is if something happens, keep it above board. Be honest about it. Keep the integrity, because it never fails. I mean, I'm sure people get away with it, right? We only hear about the ones that get busted. So I don't know. But when you're dealing with something like this, and let's be frank, even in 2016, a data breach is kind of like, oh, okay, whatever. At this point, we're just kind of like, oh, well, it happened, because we know how easy it is to happen to organizations. And it really does come down to now how they respond to it. And so if you're in an organization that something goes wrong, be above board. Let the people that may be affected know, keep the communications open. That right there will go so far to avoid brand damage, and even things like this, where now you're looking at, what other kinds of shady, underhanded things may be going on. If they're okay with this, then, it really is the big lesson here is just be honest about it, own it, and then move on.
I think those are wise words to live by. So radical transparency, be honest. People really don't care about the breach as much as they care how you respond.
Yep, exactly.
With that, I think we should wrap up. Thank you very much for joining us for our ramblings, rantings, and unstructured thoughts that flow together beautifully like a gorgeous river. So until next time.
Yeah, you must be watching a different show, man. Stay safe, everyone.
See ya.